Dr. JCM, episode 24. 25 maybe. How's it going?
All right, mate. Yourself?
A bit fatigued, actually, after that last
podcast.
It was. How long was that one, Ben?
2.
Only 2 hours? Really? Felt longer.
It was a tiny bit longer.
Felt long.
That's an intense topic. Though.
Adam Sommers, the sniper. He was saying that the attack that they had on them is the biggest attack since the Korean War or something like that that's ever been. I don't know exactly. You have to watch the episode, but fucking hell, what a guy! Driven all the way down from London, driving all the way back to London now tonight. So yeah, amazing podcast. So yeah, I'm a bit fatigued actually. I had to have a bit of a break. It takes a lot out of you. How's your week been?
Yeah, I had annual leave for the week because it was just how my rota fell. And then
Now, as a doctor, I don't know if I've known anybody to have as much time off in the last 6 months as you. He's been at this fucking studio more times than me.
Yeah, I keep getting that comment online. What I always say to you in particular is, I have always spent all of my annual leave with you.
Yeah, you kind of have, yeah.
We used to do that in school. They used to come and pick me up for tennis lessons instead of games as well.
Zesty. So,
That's a child concern, isn't it?
are you, God, yeah. Are you overnight? No? Go back?
I'm nights on Tuesday, I'm on.
What have you learnt this week?
Well, I've been off. I've been doing other stuff.
You
like
must have learnt
podcasting.
something.
Well, I've been doing Spanish mostly and just a bit of research for podcasts.
Do you know why humans have sex?
So we were talking about this. What do you want?
I want you to tell me, yeah. Because what did you say to me? What do you think the purpose of sex is? And I said to recreate.
Go on. What's your take on it? What would you assume
What? Why do I think people have sex? Why do I think sex is a thing?
biologically?
To reproduce. Yeah, to reproduce. I can't. I can't imagine any other reason for it.
What about plants and other things that reproduce asexually and make clones of themselves, like our biological ancestors?
I don't know. Enlighten me.
So it does bring in a lot of benefits. The reason sex evolved is actually to fight off parasites, which evolve more quickly than human hosts. Because if you can imagine a simpler organism, and even some reptiles are capable of doing this, when they reproduce by cloning themselves, that produces biologically identical copies, clones, which have exactly the same physiology.
Yeah.
But if you have a parasite infection or an infection of another type, which is capable of overcoming those defenses, then suddenly the entire population is vulnerable. So it doesn't take a large number of infection. It doesn't take a large number of parasites to wipe out the entire species, if that makes sense. But with sex, suddenly you've got genes coming in from 2 distinct organisms, which produces biological complexity, which is essentially the biological reason why it evolved, to help fight off disease. You look dumbfounded.
No, because I'm trying to get my head around it. So what you're saying is most plants reproduce without having to come into contact with another plant.
So plants can reproduce asexually.
Yes.
I don't think all plants can do it, but it essentially means that they make copies of themselves. But
Which is a seed that drops and then regrows.
I'm not a plantologist or whatever the word is. But
So it's an identical genetic match.
But if you think of a bacteria and human life evolved from bacterium, they simply just divide into 2 and produce 2 identical copies of each other.
Yeah.
But when you have more complex organisms which follow exactly the same process, it leaves them highly vulnerable to infection because there's no genetic diversity, there's no strengths, weaknesses that exist within that cohort, within that population.
You won't know this, so I wouldn't expect you to know this, but you might surprise me. At what stage did this branch off and become something where 2 separate organisms had to come together to create a new one, rather than it becoming from the same organism? What was that? Was that bacteria? Was it the single-celled organism? When did that branch off?
So it wouldn't have been from a single-celled organism position. There are still some animals which are capable of doing it now.
Seahorse?
Particularly sea animals. Seahorses I'm not sure about exactly, but jellyfish, for example, are one of the absolute oldest creatures, and I'm fairly confident that they can clone. But humans did evolve from sea life, so it would have been, we're talking about that level of biological taxidermy in which sex started to become a necessity. It might have been when our ancestors left biological habitats and started to live on land. That would be my guess. I'm not entirely sure, but no, let's see if we can have some sort of investigation of the truth, as I'm saying, with skepticalness, as Piers Morgan is up on that screen.
Piers Morgan is up on there, and the reason Piers Morgan is up on there...
He can't clone.
Adam was just talking in the last podcast about there was a smear campaign in the Iraq War, and Piers Morgan lost his job as editor of the Mirror because he staged photographs of British soldiers peeing on Iraqi prisoners of war, and it was all fake and staged. And Adam was saying how that had a massive effect detrimentally on the soldiers, the British soldiers, that they hadn't done that. But all of a sudden, because he was saying they went in there to win hearts and minds, so you were a peacekeeper essentially. And he was saying that it turned very quickly into them hating the British soldiers. So obviously whoever they were at war with, the soldiers, the Iraqi army, obviously hated them. But the general population, he was saying, we were good to them. We used to try and do our best to whatever. And he said so we were talking about that, and I can remember that being headline news.
I remember him getting sacked.
And that was it, because it was found that it'd all been staged in a fucking room like this, and it was of a British soldier dressed up as a soldier pissing on what looked like an Iraqi prisoner of war, all completely fucking fake, and he was proper pissed off still about it now to this day, as rightly you would be. So Ben will have to try and figure out all of that, because I don't think Tom's quite capable of it. But he doesn't know how to work it all, does he? But yeah, so interesting.
You just left him in charge, Ben.
If we roll back the genome and look, we're linked to so many things. I was listening to something yesterday and today, a podcast, and this guy was on there. He was talking about genetics, and he was saying, we are related in some way, shape or form, and it is in our genome to be able to live to 400 years old, because there are sharks that live for 400 years. There are jellyfish that essentially live forever. They don't die of anything. And all of these are common ancestors. And here it is. That's what we're talking about. So that was completely staged. And Piers Morgan lost his job over that. It just goes to show you can't believe fuck all that's in the papers, can you, in the news?
No, it's a shame for Piers Morgan as well. He's a journalist who certainly publicly likes to pride himself on being honest. Right,
and also pro-army and, the military and things like that. But no, coming back to what we were saying, and this guy was...
Ben, bring up our
this guy was really
ancestor.
Talking about, that, and how we have common ancestors that can grow back limbs in certain salamanders and things like that. And unlocking those keys could be the future to lengthening life, being able to reverse
history
aging.
of human evolution, and then just go onto Google Images, and we should be able to trace it back. You can always use South Park if everything fails.
South Park has probably got the answers. But you're going to get loads of people that say, evolution doesn't exist. It's not true. It's a lie. Fish and tetrapods into mammals.
Yeah, so between 3 and 4 at some point.
So you're saying these fish and tetrapods will probably reproducing asexually?
Well, they're much more simpler organisms. So the further you go back in that lineage, the more likely it is that the organisms reproduce by cloning, because that's a far simpler form of reproduction.
Do you know where in the world you get the most diverse of human beings? So the tallest human beings and the smallest, the most intelligent and the least intelligent, the total opposite ends of the spectrum.
Pure
Do you know
Waffle
where
Studio?
that is? No. Africa.
Is it?
Africa, yeah.
Which countries?
I'm not entirely sure. It was some, I don't know, biologist or something that was on. I think he was on Rogan who was talking about it. But and it was who was it? It'll come to me. And that was basically saying that shows you that's where the cradle of life was. Because that's where you have the most diversity. Your tallest people in the world live in Africa. Your shortest, I think they're called the pygmy people or something like that, live in Africa. People with the highest IQ as a whole, Africa. People with the lowest, Africa. There was loads of other things as well. The fastest human beings on the planet, Africa. The most diverse. You don't get that anywhere else, which was intriguing. But yeah, who knows where we're heading? What's going to happen to us in another 300 million years if we've not wiped each other out? Because you were saying on the last podcast, weren't you, that the biggest threat to humanity is depopulation?
I think it is depopulation. I don't personally think it's going to lead us to the point of extinction.
No, because while people are still shagging, we're still going, aren't we? And there's plenty of that going on.
It's interesting that you raised the point about common ancestors having different biological capabilities. Like, for instance, obviously humans are completely different to other animals, such as cats and dogs. Mm-hmm. But do you not find it fascinating that we have the same number of limbs? Obviously, they have a tail, and we seem to have exactly the same major organ systems as well.
Is that not pretty similar to all mammals, though?
But it shows you that we have all evolved from something common, is the interesting part to me. We've learned to stand on two limbs legs. And they use 4, but we still have the same number. We still have a cardiovascular system, a brain with many overlapping functions, digestive. There's huge similarities between them.
Yeah, or is that just the best end result of any evolutionary land animal? You know, one leg clearly is not going to work. Wheels aren't going to work because how would you rotate with nerves and blood vessels? How would you get that to still, it couldn't possibly work that way, could it?
Especially with the rain this month.
Did you see Loughborough was on the news? The actual news, the main news. It was so flooded.
Yeah, it's crazy, isn't it?
Fire service had to have boats in the streets. It was mad. But yeah, clearly it's...
What you're saying is quite pertinent, because if you put biologically different animals into the same environment, then what you can observe is the adaptations that they both adopt independently cause them to look quite similar. Mm-hmm. A good example of that is some types of whales with certain types of sharks. Clearly they are quite related organisms, but they look even more related than they actually are. Mm-hmm. One of the most fascinating evolutionary traits that I've ever seen is 2 types of butterflies which one of them has a certain pattern and then the other species looks slightly different. One of them is very tasty to birds and the other one had a very particularly foul taste. And then there was a third species of butterfly which evolved to look like the one that tasted foul and was able to survive as a result of that.
But actually probably tasted nice.
But actually had nothing to do with it biologically and didn't precipitate that same poor taste.
And it's amazing because when you think of evolution, you think of evolution as being intelligent, and it's not the organisms choosing to, it's literally the environment that you're in. And there are so many different adaptations that occur that fail, that you are only then left with what you are left with. And I think a lot of people, when they're talking about evolution and biology on a 1 million, 2 million year time frame, we're not talking about an intelligent force pulling itself to grow another arm. It's purely a matter of the environment. And you put something in this environment, given it enough time, on this planet, it will always end up being that.
You're absolutely right. Evolution is not intelligent design.
No.
Virtually all mutations cause no effect.
Mm-hmm.
The next most common result of a mutation is a detrimental effect. And then the third most unlikely is a random mutation which provides some sort of benefit to an organism, like that one, for instance, which causes it to look like a species, which birds don't like the taste of. And that's why it takes such long time periods for such diverse species to evolve. Do you know what the definition of a species is?
No, I don't.
Because it's quite interesting.
Is it something that can mate with it within its?
Yeah, you're on the right lines.
Yeah.
But it's quite difficult to define, and unless you know the definition of it, it's quite difficult to get your head around. Because at what point did a cat and a dog, or the thing that they both evolved from, become a different organism? Because you can imagine if you go back, they would probably look more and more similar. So the point where they become different is obviously where they become different species, and that is defined as members of the same species can mate with each other to produce fertile offspring. And I'll give you an example of that. A tiger and a lion can mate to make a liger, but a liger is infertile.
There's a donkey as well, isn't there? Horse and a donkey. Is that a mule?
Or is that an ass, or is that the same thing? I can't remember, but that's another good example.
Yeah, they can't then go on to reproduce.
Yeah,
but
so
they can be made.
Exactly. So a donkey and a horse can make a mule, but a mule then can't reproduce itself.
Yes.
So these are examples of the most similar different species, which are still distinct genetic groups.
And here is our liger. Look at the size of that bastard.
You can just tell that something's not right, can't you?
You wouldn't want to see that fucking running down at you in an alleyway, would you?
They have huge genetic problems. A liger is, I can't remember which way round it is. The other one's called it's either a female lion and a male tiger, but they produce two different things. One of them's called a liger, and then the other way around it's called something else.
A tie-in.
Something like that. But both species are infertile.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. It is incredible. The size of it. It looks overweight, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, it looks more like a tiger than lion, I think. Certainly the one on the left does.
I think the face looks more lion-esque.
Maybe. So it's a male lion, a male tiger mating with a female lion.
So that's a liger. And what happens when it's a female lion and a male
lion
tiger?
Mating with a tiger. Don't know.
Ben, get off videos.
Tigress. Wow. A tigress. Not a tigress. That's that Kung Fu Panda.
Ben, go back onto tiger. A female tiger, also a tigerish woman.
and then look at the pictures down here. You've got Angelina Jolie, Kerry Wildgran, and Tara Strong. I think they just probably played characters in this.
Oh, it's a film, Tigress.
Yes. Do you think if humans continue evolving, we become aliens with the 3 fingers, the big heads, no sexual reproductive organs, and telepathic? Is that where we're going?
Well, I think that's an impossible question to answer, certainly parts of it. I don't think telepathy will be a thing, if I'm being honest. I can't sit here rationally to you and articulate why, but certainly my instinct is that it doesn't fit with my rules. I'd certainly have to see very convincing evidence of it otherwise.
What if it's a technological advance that enables us to
That's the thing.
then
so
become telepathic?
Telepathy, depending on how we define it, exactly.
Yeah.
From a purely biological perspective, I don't think so. I think that's getting into the realms of science fiction. But there's certainly an argument to make that, for instance, a lie detector, heart rate going up, people feeling stressed, body language becoming uncomfortable, mincing their words, things, recounting events with inaccuracy. I think there's an argument that is a degree of telepathy. It's not exactly what you're thinking, but certainly reads to what you're feeling.
It's non-verbal communication, is what it is.
Most communication is non-verbal.
Yeah, it's something ridiculous, like 90%, isn't it, or something like that?
I'm not sure how they define it.
Well, non-verbal. I think that's pretty self-explanatory.
In terms of the quantification for how much communication is verbal and non-verbal, like is that the exchange of information, or is it the rapport that you naturally start to build with someone? I would have thought it's more the latter.
Possibly. I don't know. I don't know how you would test it, but yeah. What is it, Ben? I'm sure it's like 80 or 90%. It's like, wow.
It is the majority.
Wow.
It is the majority.
And that's why if you spend more time looking at the person rather than necessarily trying to hear what they're saying, you can... 55%. 55% body language. Spoken words, 7%. Voice and tone. So
that in reality, that's 45% verbal there and 55%.
Well, does voice and tone, does that... Because I can say to you, I love you, but the tone that I say it in could convey a completely different message. So although the verbal words coming out of my mouth are conveying a message, actually the underlying tone, which is... It's non-verbal in a sense, isn't it? It is verbal because it's audible. Tone modulation and pauses. So it's kind of non-verbal. The words is what I would say is what you would call verbal communication.
See, I would describe the words as only part of verbal communication because
maybe.
Otherwise it's excluding any other animal which isn't capable of pronouncing words. I've got a thing for you. What do you think is one of the key differences between a human brain and that of other animals?
The language centre
language
is much
centre.
bigger. And is that in the prefrontal cortex?
Oh, where's the language centre? I don't know, I'd have to Google it. Why do you reckon that's so important, though?
I'm not entirely sure why it's so important, but I do know why it's happened. So...
Well, we'll come back to the importance. Yeah, say what you were going to say, yeah.
As primates, we used to spend all of our time in the trees. And any primate or any animal that spends its time in a tree cannot go into very deep, long stages of sleep for fear of falling out the tree and dying. Once humans invented fire, it allowed them to sleep on the ground without fear of predators, insect, bugs, things like that. We then developed longer, and again, find this if you can. I think out of all the primates, human beings, in fact, I know it's right because it's exactly what I read. We have the longest periods of REM sleep, deep sleep, whatever it is, out of all of the primates. And what that allowed us to do was it allowed us to start developing these language centers, but it also allowed us to start defragmenting and breaking down all of the social cues and things that had happened in the day. And that then allowed us to start creating things like language. So, we talk about baboons and things like that. But yeah, so that's kind of what, and it was the invention of fire, which then brought us out of the trees, which meant that because we were no longer tree dwelling, we were able to go through these cycles of sleep at a much more effective rate to then help that brain development, which then went on to social cues, learning body language, social constructs, and language as a part of that, which I would guess then is why the language centres are bigger.
Yeah, so obviously we're capable of far more communication. The reason why I didn't want to particularly pin down on a part of the brain in which you find the language centre is there's two important parts. One of them is the understanding, the comprehension language centre, but that's distinctly different to the expressive one. Does that make sense? So that, for instance, a part of your brain that understands the language that I'm speaking to you now is not the same part you use to express your own language. So we have multiple language centres within the brain. But absolutely, these are the parts that are particularly developed in humans. But here's some food for thought. So imagine how limited our thought process and capacity would be without language. So, for instance, you and Ben just went off to KFC. You've probably not pictured... you've pictured KFC in your mind, but you've probably not drawn out the entire route.
No.
You've not gone, right, I'm going to walk down the door and I'm going to take the first right out the studio and I'm going to go to this road, that road. I'm going to get to KFC, order food, have food, bring it back and eat it. You've just gone, the way you've formed that thought in your mind is you've said, I'm going to go to KFC.
Yeah.
Imagine how you would have tried to form that thought if you didn't know English.
I've often thought and pondered on this.
It's a bizarre question because you're literally thinking about what would it be like not to think, because we use language to organize our thoughts. express our desires and then communicate it to other people. But if you didn't know that, then suddenly the amount of communication, but also thought capacity that you're capable of is so diminished. I sat down and literally just thought about this for 20 minutes, the first night this ever occurred to me. You're not capable of thought as we think of it. You know certain instincts, like for instance, you know when you were hungry, you would be able to sense danger, but you're not thinking on anything like the level of what you and I think of it now. And that's where humans can excel, where other species can't, because we can use our language to organize highly complex thought processes and put that into action. Other species can't do that.
So last night, it must have been about 2:15 at night. My dog came upstairs and it shook me. She needed to go out for a wee. So she's had a feeling in her bladder. She's known where I am. She's known to go up the stairs, make a soft noise, not a loud bark that was startling, just enough to wake me up. And then I would then get up and let her outside for a wee. I can't comprehend how that can happen without language.
So needing a wee is quite a primitive biological need, for instance. Like, we're aware of the fact that we need to urinate without thinking, I need to urinate, because you feel the signals in your bladder. And obviously, if you suppress the urge for long enough, it actually turns into some level of pain. And she knows where you sleep by memory. But I actually think that's quite a good example, because that's a very basic biological need, necessity that Kira's addressed. If you contrast that with something that you've been woken up for, or when Megan or Lily have come to find you, for instance, those tasks, certainly some of them, are likely to have been far more complex. So that's the difference. The language allows organization of the complex thoughts as opposed to just simple biological needs. So give us another example of when, I don't know, Megan came to you saying, Dad, I need a lift for work, for instance.
Yeah.
That, in terms of its cognitive demand on the brain and the language center, it's a completely different entity. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, totally. Totally. It is fascinating. Because I've often said this to you before. I'm fascinated with people that learn another language, and you obviously taught yourself to speak Italian fluently. And I've said to you many times, and people that do, are bilingual, at what point can you start thinking in that other language? Because that has to be a tipping point, doesn't it, where you've now completely remodeled parts of your brain so that now it isn't a translation of thought, it is just a thought.
It's generation of thought.
Yes.
Yeah, it's very different. It's a really interesting question, actually, because had you asked me this when I was bilingual, I would give you a different answer to the one I would give now, having subsequently learned Spanish. At the point I started, so for anyone not listening, I have zero linguistic talent, just to put it out there. And when I say zero, I mean I studied French for 11 years. I don't know a single word of French.
Surely you know how to ask where the post office is. That's all we ever learned.
Well, the thing is, all I would do is just take the Italian or Spanish words and just make them sound a bit French, and it normally works. But just to put it into context, how bad my French was. I sat in that, I didn't study it forever, just because I absolutely hated it. Didn't particularly get on with the teachers. The lessons were all ineffective, and then it all came crashing down when it was 20 minutes before I was going to do my GCSE listening exam. So I'm looking at the paper or like some sort of revision manual thinking, I have not done anything to prepare myself for this moment in 11 years. So I was like, what do I do at this point? I've got the exam in 20 minutes. So I ring my brother up and I'm like, Greg, I've got my French listening exam. I've not studied French for a decade. Have you got any advice? He actually tried to help me, bless him. And I went into that exam genuinely feeling like I'd just been released from a hostage situation. I didn't understand anything that was going on.
Sounds like my life.
But then I did go back to it later on, and I learned it in a completely different way, and I was able to learn Italian fluently. At the point I started thinking in it, I think I was quite fluent. And then I started dreaming in it as well, which is also a bizarre thing to comprehend. I remember the first time I woke up thinking, that's just such a surreal experience. I don't know how to describe it. Because when you're dreaming, that's totally subconscious. I mean, that really is just independent thought generation. I think at that point I was fluent. But the interesting thing is, when I then learned Spanish, I started dreaming and thinking in Spanish long before I was fluent in it. So I think it must have just remodeled some areas of my brain to think differently. And I think what probably happened is that obviously English is still my first language, and the thought generation part of my brain realized that it also had this other mechanism by which it could do it, Italian, but I still can't generate quite the same complexity and nuances in Italian as I can in English, but I was still generating those thoughts. And I think at the point Spanish came along, that was a third one. Obviously that part of my cognitive physiology was developed enough where it was able to produce a more basic thought, but it was still independent. I feel like I've not explained that quite well.
No, you have. And I'm trying to think of an example that works with me, and it's almost a little bit like if I got a load of sticks and bits of wood, and I'd never built anything in my life before, it might be a matter of trial and error, and I'm starting to just do things. But the more that I do that, the ability to then map that out in my head before I do it becomes easier. So a little bit like asking someone to, in their mind, hit a topspin second serve in tennis. If they've never done it before, they can't visualize it. They can't visualize it. But going through the physical process of doing it then allows them to be able to imagine it, which ultimately all thinking in a different languages is imagination, isn't it? It's imagining the words and the thoughts in that different language. You know, if I say to you, think about a pink elephant on a tightrope on a unicycle, it's there now. That's been put there. And it's putting those thoughts into your head in that different language. So the process of you going through that, in a sense, practicing that second serve over and over and over and over again whilst you were learning Italian, somehow made it easier for you to visualize the process of Spanish. I don't know.
Yeah, no, it did for sure. It was also a completely different learning method. So I have a big problem with how schools teach languages, for instance. You're generally taught random vocab, and you're expected to memorize a huge number of words and write out complex grammar rules without really using the language itself. Like, for instance, you would never teach a baby to learn English in that way. You wouldn't not do anything with them and then just get them to copy out grammar and like memorize how to say various aspects of the contents of their pencil case, for instance. It doesn't make any sense. Yet we insist on teaching it a second and third language in that way. It's almost like if you can imagine thousands of tiny little circles with clear centers all linked up together, forming a big circle with lots of different smaller components.
Just an outer circle.
Thousands of them, yeah. We would learn English by learning the most common vocab. And imagine every time you learn something, one of those circles lights up. The way you teach languages to young children is that you start with the most basic words, and then they naturally hear, listen, learn to repeat, and then you gradually add in the complexity of the sentence. So that's little tiny dots that are key to the language, which are all lighting up, if that makes sense. And then gradually it builds and builds like a snowball effect. My analogy, this is what my feeling of school language teaching is, that you just take random dots, you just light, but there's no connection between any of them. And it's like a destination without any roads to get there. It's meaningless. You can't access it. And the way that I was able to essentially have far more success doing that was, I'm going to take what the method was for learning English and replicate that as accurately as possible. I start with unbelievably simple things. Just listen and repeat on an audio program. Just have simple vocab. And then naturally everything does build out of the middle. And the middle outwards is it's a slow progress, but at least it's something. At least the progress sticks because all the learning points bind together and make sense. It's not just bang, 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 just random points of that map lighting up with no interconnection between them.
Or maybe that's just the way that your brain works. Because surely there are people out there that are refining teaching methods, doing studies of how people learn. I don't know, maybe they're not. Maybe it's just this antiquated sitting down, parroting times tables and parroting Ilia, whatever it might be.
Remember
times
Ilia?
Haven't moved on. Ilia, I don't even know what it means.
It's there is / there are in
is.
French.
Ilia. Yeah. Fucking waste of time. But equally, because you wanted to learn Italian, I think you would have done using any method.
I couldn't have learnt it on the school method.
You not reckon? Is that not what Duolingo works by? You know, the app that
Duolingo
you
is
can get?
really not very effective.
Isn't it?
No, it's like having a glass of Coke, for instance. It tastes nice. It's quite fun. It's an enjoyable process, but it's really not doing an awful lot of good for you. If you're taking a dump and you've got Duolingo on your phone,
Fine.
okay. But in any other context, there's far, far better resources you can be using.
Like what? So if somebody wanted to start learning a language after watching this podcast,
Yeah.
where would you tell them to go?
Okay, well, let's make it more fun. Which one would you want to learn?
Spanish, probably.
Spanish, okay. So, well, let's give you the option. So you can learn it by the school method, which is where you learn an awful lot of vocab. A lot of it is not in particularly common use in spoken Spanish. And then it's grammar rule. What I would recommend to you is go and learn the top 500 most common words, which account for the vast majority of spoken and written communication. So learn what they mean, and then download an audio program where you just listen and repeat, and you don't even actively study any grammar. But because you listen, repeat, you start to notice similarities and sentence structure that you just naturally start to assimilate in your brain. Go and do that for 20 hours, and you'll have learned more Spanish grammar than you ever will have in 10 years of school for most people, for instance. So I would do that. Then I would learn, then after you've done that process, you'd be surprised how much you can speak and listen, because in the same way, you've also been listening to Spanish. So you come out of that knowing the most common words, knowing a decent amount of grammar, you've put your speaking into practice and your listening into practice. That whole process you can probably do at least for the first 100 hours of study. And it gets easier and easier. By the end of that, you're not going to believe how much you've learnt. After 20 minutes and 10 minutes in Italian, I'd realised I'd learnt more of the language fundamentally than I had in 11 years of French. Obviously, I knew more words in French, but I didn't understand anything. It was totally alien to me. At that point, you're ready just to pick up books and start chatting to people. You need to speak to people early. The conversations you have are very, very basic, but then they slowly become more and more complex. And go and watch Spanish TV. Get some Spanish books. If it's not something you would ever read in English, I wouldn't recommend reading it in another language either, because you're not going to enjoy it. And just make flashcards, and then you just learn by assimilation. Just write down with online flashcards the words that you don't know. And within a couple of months, you realise that you were never bad at languages. You weren't. I don't think anyone is. Because we've all learned
We've
English.
all learned English.
We've all learned English perfectly.
Without anybody teaching it us.
Do you remember studying English grammar? I can't.
Yeah, a little bit, but
Certainly complex writing systems.
yes. But I always find it fascinating that because you guys being at the tennis club, quite often you've had exchange students coming over from various places, and I always find it fascinating that the French or the German or whatever, wherever they're from, they almost know English better than we know English. They know all of the grammar and punctuation and what this and that means. And it's kind of like, yeah, I just speak it. It's like you've said, they've been taught, instead of learning how to just drive the car, you've been taught how to assemble the car, disassemble the car, add different things to it. All of that just to be able to drive the car.
It's like, just go and drive the car.
Just go and drive the car. Because most people, I don't know, my kids have come back from school sometimes saying, oh, Dad, what does this mean and that mean? And I'm like, I don't know. I can't remember. I don't need to know what alliteration is and intonation in this and what I can't even remember now, but some of these things, and you're thinking, these kids are in year 5 and year 6. They don't need to know that. I mean, I sometimes still get confused what a verb and a noun and an adjective. I'm thinking, I can't remember. I don't need to know that. I don't need to know that to communicate with you, to find something on the internet, to go about my day-to-day life. So it does make sense, and that's clearly how babies learn. They just listen, and if I see you saying glass enough time, glass, it doesn't take long for me to think glass, and now I've picked it up.
Yeah.
It's like when I've gone through stages before where I love just going through the dictionary and looking at words that I've never heard of before or never, didn't even know existed. You look at it a couple of times and you're like, that's amazing. You've forgotten it 3 days down the line.
So imagine how inefficient that process of just learning random words is in another language. It's so inefficient, it's unbelievable.
Yeah. Maybe you need to come up with this new methodology of teaching languages in schools. Maybe that's your golden ticket out of med school.
It's hard to, I don't want to sit here and give a hard time to teachers, because I think the reality changes when you've got 30 kids in front of you.
That aren't interested. And you're not interested in them.
Well, that wouldn't make it easy, would it? That would certainly complicate the task.
It does.
One thing that is quite interesting, where you said you noticed that certain foreign people seem to be able to communicate in English better than we can. I've noticed, particularly in the Latin languages, people can have unbelievable vocabularies, and the reason for that is that most words in English are Latin. It's about 60-70%, something like that. But the Latin roots are very deep, they're very old. It's typically the more complex words.
Yeah.
And the base of our language is Germanic. So I'll give you an example for that. What that means is typically the common words, the very short, simple words, assimilate more like German, and the more complex words are more similar to French, Latin, Spanish, Italian. It's an unbelievable advantage when you go to learn one of those languages, because your vocabulary is artificially amplified by a massive amount. For instance, presentation, presentazione, or you just give me any word that ends in ation. Normally, it's the same word, just with a different ending.
Trepidation.
Trepidazione. There's probably a lot of people who don't even know what trepidation means. So when you hear, until I went through that process myself, I didn't consciously acknowledge that fact. And for instance, I would see Europeans coming over here using unbelievably complex words, and I'm like, how on earth have you learnt it so well? It's because it's a very common word in their language. So, for instance, one of the criticisms Nadal's faced over the years is he's not always had the highest level of spoken English compared to players like Federer and Djokovic. And then he came out, I saw him do an interview, and he came out with the word polemics. And I was like, what on earth does that mean?
What does that mean?
Well, a very similar word means argument in Spanish. So once you've acknowledged that, it makes so much sense. So you'll never see that habit on the same level, that tendency, with people who speak English as a second language who don't speak a Romance language as the first. So, for instance, Chinese, Japanese, Russian speakers are all at distinct disadvantages speaking English compared to people with European language
because
roots.
the base isn't there. It's a completely different. It's like using a different alphabet.
It's interesting with Russian in particular, though, because some of the bases actually are quite similar, but it's when you go even further back. So it's languages linked together in a very comparable way to biology and species. If you go further and further back, then you do start to pick up connections between them. And the further you go back, the more different and distinct everything becomes. And some languages are totally different. Like, for instance, Japanese has nothing whatsoever to do with English. Mm-hmm. Or Arabic. They're totally different language families. But Russian, if you go far enough back, then there are linkages. And that's why one of my friends who speaks Russian, I asked her, like, how different is it to you speaking English and speaking Russian? And she was like, I don't think it's that different at all, to be honest, because in her mind, she doesn't acknowledge the differences between them and just recognizes the similarities. Mm-hmm. But if you ask a Japanese speaker, for instance, what's it like speaking Japanese to like speaking English? It's totally different. If you were to literally translate a sentence in English and Italian, you would virtually always be able to extrapolate the meaning.
There wouldn't be a lot lost in translation.
Exactly. I mean, sometimes the word order would be very, very strange, and sometimes you would be, what on earth does that mean? But if you were to do that with English and Japanese, then it would more likely appear, and it's more likely to appear as, for instance, reorder this sentence so that it makes sense. Mm-hmm. It'll be like, the man. No, I don't even know how to say that. Imagine taking a sentence and just putting it completely out of order. You wouldn't be able to understand it.
Yeah.
Have you ever seen English from 1,000 years ago?
I've heard it. Yeah, I've heard it. I often hear it. It sounds very Latin, doesn't it?
Well, I've never heard it's spoken, but I think Ben's bringing up the written form.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I've listened to those videos before, where it is, this is English 500 years ago. This is English 700 years ago. This is English 2,000 years ago, and it always goes back to sounding like, the way I always describe it is, if you ever watch those horror movies where, it's the Catholic priest is trying to exorcise the devil out of somebody, and they start spitting this Latin kind of like, it sounds a lot like that. That might get us copyrighted. No? No.
Whack it on full screen, Ben.
Oft schildschering scherden a thratum, monogam machtam, meda setla oft tach. Exo de erlas, sithen arrest worth, fair shaft funden. Heithas froveri abad, works under walknum, werth mundum thach. Ofet him aya.
Wow. There's a lot of letters in there that do look like the Russian, Polish type.
So that was Old English. Let's have a look at Middle English.
Now reading in Middle English.
So a more common ancestor.
The first stanza of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight in the original Middle English.
Middle English. I don't know what period of time that was.
The sage and the assault was ceased at Troy. The Borg Britain and Brent.
Sounds Scottish.
The talk that the Thomas of Trade
or Welsh.
Was treated for his treachery, the truest on
Irish, yeah. Celtic.
That sit in depressed provinces and patronus become. Well native of all the way in the west.
It's actually more easy to understand hearing it than it is reading. I don't think you can see this on the screen.
No.
But reading it doesn't look like anything.
No, it doesn't. Amazing.
I think that's illustrated the point.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Wow. Yeah, no, it's I tell you what else is also fascinating is listening to what English sounds like to non-English speaking people.
Yes.
It's fascinating because you almost understand it, but it is complete gobbledygook.
So,
A business account?
well, let's listen to it. And then
It's unbelievable.
Yeah.
It really is unbelievable because it's like, I understand what they're saying, but I got no idea what they're saying.
I often feel like that on foreign music.
Yes.
Is that Tom Holland?
Oh, hey, Nathan. Wat zijn de haasje? Lining, panning, barbening, amendments, hey? It's carpetable. Hashing guards, actually. Tracy Palin got having it since, like, before I was a soap in an ottoman or something. It was palatable.
But actually, sounds a little bit like the Middle English one, doesn't it? There are kind of words that you recognise in places that they shouldn't be, surrounded by words that you understand the sounds, but you don't really know the meaning.
Yeah. So, I mean, typically, I'd quite like to see one just on English words where they completely restructure the grammar and word order, because that would be a really good illustration as to how different Japanese is,
Yes.
or Arabic or Chinese.
Yes.
Totally unintelligible with words you understand.
And in another 200 years' time, you might find that people struggle to understand what we're saying now in certain aspects, maybe 300-400 years' time. But certainly what we're speaking now is not what people are going to be speaking forever. I wonder if there becomes a universal language. See, I've always thought this.
Great topic.
Why not teach a universal sign language to all children in the world? You could communicate to everybody in the world. I don't know if that's possible because of sentence structure and things like that. But if there was a universal hand signal for glass, because everybody uses a glass and everybody has a table and everybody has hands, and you taught that to children from age 4 onwards, that would solve a hell of a lot of world problems, wouldn't it? And that is not beyond the wit of man.
No. It is an interesting idea. One of the things with sign language is that although it is recognized as a language, it has to be pointed out that the complexity and nuances compared to a spoken and written language are just simply not there.
Yes.
For instance, if you try and learn Spanish for 100 hours and you tried to learn sign language for 100 hours, your relative progress in both languages would be completely different.
Mm-hmm.
And because it is a far simpler form of communication, that does reflect in the complexity of information that you can transmit to other people.
But equally, there would still be some transmission of information.
Absolutely, there would.
Which would make, maybe then we go into body language and things like that. I don't know. Maybe then we're going into telepathy again, aren't we? Which is where we were.
Have you ever heard of Esperanto?
No, I don't think so.
So they tried to essentially do the idea of what you're describing, but with a more complete language with written and spoken forms. So they combined aspects. The reason it didn't work is that it was too European. But essentially what they did is just design a completely new invented language with aspects of many different languages in the simplest possible way. And people were learning it unbelievably quickly, 10 times quicker than they could learn any other typical language. So they would just take out the arbitrary complexities that weren't necessary in different languages and just combine it into something that's very logical and easy to learn. Like, I'll give you an example of how the Romance language works. For instance, we say, I eat, you eat, he eats, they eat. In Italian, it's a completely different word. It's mangio, mangi, mangia, mangiamo. Totally different word. And you have to do that for every single verb. But apart from every single verb, you also have to do it for all the verb tenses. So, for instance, I will eat, you will eat, he will eat, they will eat. Again, it's a different word. Mangerò, mangerai, mangeranno, mangeremo. When you have to do, every verb can change about 80 times. It's obscene. So can you imagine how many verbs there are doing words, i.e., run, talk, eat, sleep? the amount of vocab that you have to learn is so complex. I mean, that's an example where English is far easier, because you just change, the actual word stays the same, and then you just change the subject, I, you, him, we. So what Esperanto did was things like that, where they just made it as simple as possible. And here we go, it's the world's
1887.
most widely spoken constructed auxiliary language. Like, for instance, La lingua internazionale. I think that's made up. But it looks like it's easy to understand.
The international language.
Look at what it's put in brackets.
La lingua internazionale.
That's not Italian, and it's not Spanish, and it's not French.
But
Yeah,
international
exactly.
language.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, I often, because I've dabbled in looking at Spanish, things like that, and they're a very phonetic language, aren't they? So they will pronounce the E at the end of things.
Makes it far easier.
We have a silent E, which changes the
intonation.
The intonation of the...
Your point's there, though.
What's it called? The A-E-I-O-U, vowel.
That's what you're trying to say.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to say.
That's how people say words, yeah. No, you're absolutely right, though. So we don't necessarily pronounce everything in English the way it's written.
Mm-hmm.
Latin languages typically...
Yes.
Well, certainly Spanish and Italian are far more phonetic. French isn't always that phonetic.
No. Which is mad. I'm also obsessed sometimes with the stupidity of the human language. Sorry, the English language, not the human language. Wind and wind. And all of these words that look the same and act the same but sound different. Or, well, if I put so why is bomb, B-O-M-B, but bomb is B-O-M, B-O-M. Plain.
Yeah.
There's no Y in it. There's an I in it. You know what I mean? It's but you can just see that's just layers upon layers of things that have come before it and before it and before it, and new things coming into popular culture that we now talk about. He talks about zesty as being what we understand as being zesty, but actually if you went home and you said to your mum and dad zesty, they're thinking about the taste, the flavour of zest. So things do morph and adapt and change. Zesty. It's
like what we said about evolution. It's not intelligent design, and it's exactly the same case in languages as well.
Yes.
It is evolution.
Yes.
It's the adoption of many different systems and communication into something common.
So does this now fit in and usher in a new era for AI to come in and go, I've analysed every language that there's ever been, and I'm going to formulate a new language that is easy to learn, understood, communicate, boom, for everybody?
I think it's a process that's going to happen naturally. There's over 5,000 languages in the world.
Yeah.
Within 100 years, 90% of them are likely to have died out.
Yes.
And I was thinking about this. I can't decide if I think it's something sad or not. Like, you're not a massive fan of literature. In contrast to me, I think it's great. For instance, The Lord of the Rings, one of the best bits of British and worldwide literature that has ever existed. The wisest and most intelligent beings in that are the elves, but they only speak 2 or 3 languages. So I think it is the natural progression of a species to come together and speak fewer tongues that more people speak.
Well, you're creating a bottleneck, aren't you? And for the transmission of information, you need to get rid of these bottlenecks as best as you can. So evolution would state that, yeah, we are going to move towards somewhere in which information can be passed as quickly, you know, and binary, I guess, was the first one of those, really. In your computer languages, and you know, we've gone from having lots of different computer programming platforms, C+ and Python and all of these different things, and eventually there's just going to be one, isn't there? Because the time that it takes to translate and lose things in translation and re-input it can be eradicated. Which, yeah. Joe Rogan's got a theory, and I do like his theory, is human beings, is the sole purpose of our being to create artificial life and intelligence, because we have this hunger to innovate and make things better. We didn't need an iPhone 15 because the iPhone 14 was just as good. But we are going to have an iPhone 30. And it's a small incremental change each way. And it looks as though we are moving a non-stop train towards creating an artificial intelligence, whether that's silicone-based, biological-based, a mixture of both. Is that then what then gets sent out into the universe to go and populate other things? Do we ultimately become a silicon-based organism or life form, and we are the master creators from those cavemen that were like, this is fire, now I cook food on this fire, now I do this, and now I've made a wheel, and now I've made this, and now I've made a spear, and all of a sudden, where does it stop? Because we've all got great houses, or is that just capitalism?
What do you mean capitalism?
Well, the reason Apple have made an iPhone 15
Sure.
is because there's money involved in it. If all of a sudden we says, right, there's no more money on planet Earth, do we stop innovation? So is innovation a natural trait of human beings, or has capitalism brought that innovative side out of us? Is it two parts of the same sword?
Well, it's both, isn't it? Because capitalism does produce inequality.
Yes.
No denying it, but it also produces wealth and innovation. And the reason it produces that is that people are able to come up with new and innovative ways to address the problems which we have today.
Mm-hmm.
And then its test on whether it is effective or not, whether it's useful for a society, is the society, and whether that is uptaken or not. Which is why you're always going to have more innovation in a capitalist society, whereas in a socialist society, with everything belonging to the people, that technically would be communism or the government in socialism, then there isn't that individual incentive for people to be innovative in the same way. So it absolutely is a result of capitalism. I've heard Richard Dawkins, obviously a very, very famous biologist, was talking about this very thing, and whether the future of the human race is via our artificial inventions.
In what sense?
Is that what's going to be left of us? Essentially what you were saying.
Yes. I do think it, because
I think it as well.
We're not a million miles away from being able to upload part, if not all, of our consciousness, of our memories, of our experiences, because ultimately everything we smell, see, taste, do are electrical impulses that have occurred in the brain that have been figured out and presented to us as a sense. Is this going to be possible via artificial means rather than a light coming into my eyes and my brain having to are we going to be able to plug ourselves into something and have that? Probably. And once we're at that level, is it a far cry to say, yeah, I'm going to get a 500 terabyte microchip that's that big, and I'm going to upload all of my experiences up until this point now, and every day I'm going to upload it so that if I die, I just reinstall from where I was. But then the question is, what if we're already there? What if you died yesterday and all that's happened now is you've just re-uploaded that 25 terabyte of Jamie Moncrief and everything you've learned? You wouldn't know the difference.
I think it's a discussion that I feel completely unqualified to participate in,
but it's a great thought experiment, isn't it?
It is a thought experiment. I mean, you've said to me before that you think we are living in a computer simulation. I personally don't think you do think that on your deepest level.
I think saying a computer simulation is very rudimental in its framework, because it gives you visions of a PC screen in front of a keyboard. Would we, if we had the power to, create a we're doing it already. Grand Theft Auto 6 is going to be phenomenal in its scope. Now, if you were able to populate the characters in that with some form of large language model, i.e. ChatGPT 6 or 7 when it's out, and create a form of consciousness within that character, how would they know?
Well, they wouldn't.
How would they know? They wouldn't. Now, if we could run that simulation and say, okay, we're going to run this simulation now, increasing CO2 levels on the planet by 0.1% over the next century, I want to see what happens so that we don't make that same mistake in base reality. Would we do that? And if we can do it in one frame, in one sense, why wouldn't we do it in a million? And then it gets you into the thought processes of, well, people do talk about a multiverse where you and I are having this conversation right now, but there's no glass there. And you and us are having this conversation now, but Ben's got blue eyes instead of brown. And every single thing that could happen is happening, has happened, and will happen. Well, is that not just the same as running infinite simulations of something which, again, is just evolution? Would we do that if we had the capabilities of doing it? Yeah. So I think the only thing to think about is, do we think we'll ever get to that point? Because if we think we're going to get to that point, bearing a meteorite crashing into the earth or World War III occurring, if you think that we're going to get there, who's to say we haven't already?
I think there would be very good answers to it.
Yeah, maybe.
But you'd have to just get someone on who's equipped to have that kind of discussion.
Well, I don't think anybody is, are they?
I think there's people far more equipped than a junior doctor and a tennis coach, though.
Maybe, or maybe not.
There is.
Or maybe not. Put your date of birth in.
Oh, we're going to do this thought. What is it?
It's
Person
called
type.
Chinese numerology. That the underpinning of everything in the universe is numbers.
24th September 97.
There we go. Read it. Read it and weep, doctor.
Would he give me this?
24, 7.
I don't know what 7 is.
No, 9.
24, 9.
September.
1997.
97.
How was somebody born in 1997?
So it's going to give the same result for anyone born on that birthday.
For that birthday, yes. But when you go into it and you put your name in and things like that, so your life path 5. Oh, whoa.
People need to change.
Oh, whoa.
They want to come to the podcast full time.
These people need movement and change, and they like to travel. Oh, right. They search for freedom and adventure. They are open to new things and ideas. They have an inclination to leadership. They're ambitious, but they're also very sensitive and avoid routine and boredom. They're impressed by people who are able to convince them in some area. Weaknesses. These people should be careful to succumb to sudden ideas, instability, inclination to be nervous and restlessness. They should keep a balance in the emotional, professional, and financial areas. They do not like rules and restrictions and cannot be forced to do something. Beware of accidents. That is you, Dr. Jamie Moncrief. I thank you. I rest my case.
That might be the most accurate.
Put mine up. Put mine up.
You astonished, Jamie?
Are you starting? Look at his face.
I'm not, because it's just so generic.
Okay, read mine. 22, 10, 78. It is not generic.
Right, I'll read this
Read
out
mine.
for you.
Read this out for me. Your jaw is going to hit the table, Mr. Jamie Moncrief. 22, 10, 1978. Life path 3. Here we go.
Put it up a tiny bit, Ben.
Read it out loud.
These people are mentally alert and have creative minds. They are creative and original, and they have a good imagination. They hate boredom and like to cooperate with others. They are charming and witty. They are critical of others and should therefore learn how to be more diplomatic. They need to work freely and without restraints. They like working in pairs. They often work better under stress, which activates their mental energy. They usually succeed quickly. They need to be more ambitious and to open up more. They are inventive and imaginative in solving problems. They make new contracts easily, but are sometimes superficial. Contacts easily. They make decisions fast, but they are not always the correct ones. Weaknesses. Hang on, what? How are you? Your weakness is about half the length of mine. Beware of restlessness, distractibility, bad temper, irritability, fear of dullness, and uneven financial life.
Oh dear.
Beware of carelessness. But there's some bits in that are so stark, not you.
Like what?
We'll go up to it. They like working in pairs. You often work individually, for
Often?
instance.
Often.
Work better under stress. That definitely does tie into you because you need
Definitely.
amount of stress. But
Creative?
so do a lot of people. They usually succeed quickly. I mean, that's true in some cases and not in others.
Charismatic.
You only said to me the other day how many times in your life you feel like you've failed.
Many times.
They usually succeed quickly. So, I mean, that's true for some examples for you, but not for others. A lot of it does match up. New contacts easily, but are sometimes superficial. They make decisions fast, but they are not always the correct one. I remember you. So we got a new lock at the tennis club, Ben.
A new what? Lock?
We got a new lock because before we just had a key.
Here we go.
Before we had a key just to get into the tennis club, and Nick obviously had one of those keys, and then they changed it to a locking system so that all members had one, and it had 10 numbers on it, and you had to give 4 numbers in the correct sequence. The code was, I don't know, whatever it was. Let's say it was 1, 2, 3, 4. Nick was arguing with me. He was like, so what's the chance of guessing it correctly? I think it's 4 out of 10, because if there's 10 numbers and you need to get 4 of them, 1, 2, 3, 4, you were arguing there was a 40% chance.
No, but you're slightly wrong in what you've just said. You didn't have to get them in the right order. You just had to get those 4 numbers. So if it was 1, 2, 3, 4, you could put in 3, 1, 2, 4 and it would open. You could put in 2, 1, 4, 3 and it would open.
Yeah.
So out of those 10 numbers, you only had to get 4 of them right in any order.
So what do you think the chances?
I think it's 40%.
You were fixed on that belief.
I'm not good at maths.
Yeah, there's some error in calculation. I can't figure out where it is, but
My way of thinking was, if I got 4 fingers and just randomly pressed 4 on there, I'm going to get it right at some point. Because I don't have to get them in the right order. Now, if you had to get them in the right order, now we are
different ball game.
Totally different.
Okay, but even if you don't have to get them in the right order,
Yeah.
it makes the maths, it's still not
I
difficult.
reckon it's a 50% chance. Yes. But, mate, honestly, do one of these properly and put your date of birth in and your name and where you're born, and it's unbelievable.
I really the maths is so easy. I really just want to tell you how to do it now.
I don't give a fuck.
Yeah, but I know you don't.
I just put the code in and just fucking opened the gate. But I just thought it was a bit of I thought it was a slightly weak way of putting a combination.
Yeah,
I understand having to get it in the right order, but not just. There's only 10 numbers on there, and you can only press one of them numbers once because there was never a double 1 in there. There's never a double 2 in there. So there's 10 numbers. You've just got to get 4 of them.
But you wouldn't know from the outside. There's the same number's not used twice.
Well, okay, so somebody told you that. So somebody said to you, look, there's 10 numbers here. You can't press the same number twice. You've just got to get 4 of them right in any order. It's a hell of a lot easier to get into than if you said, right, you've got to get 4 numbers, but it's got to be the right order. Because 1, 2, 3, 4 is different to 2, 3, 1, 4.
Okay, let's go. Can I borrow the pen? So there's 10 numbers.
Yeah.
You need to get 4 of them right.
4 of them right.
You can't use the same number.
You're not going to use
What's
the same
the
number.
chance of getting the first number right?
1 in 10.
No, it's 4 out of 10.
4, is it?
Yeah, there's 4
yes,
numbers.
okay, 4 out of 10.
4 out of 10. Okay, so you get that correct.
Mm-hmm. 3 out of 10.
3 out of 9. But you have to times them together.
Okay.
So 4 out of 10 times 3 over 9 times
2 of 8, 1 of 7.
Times 1 over 7.
Yeah.
It's a much more remote chance than you think, because 7 times 8 is 56. 56 times 9.
551.
So, and then times that by 10.
5,000 and
So let's call it whatever.
5,051.
Let's roughly call it 5,000, whatever it is. Might be 5, probably a bit more than that. 4 times 3 is 12, times 2 is 24. If you're going to do 24 over that number, well, we can make it a little bit more simple. 2.4 over 2,500.
Maths lesson for those at home.
It's a much lower chance than you think.
It's 1.2 out of 1,200. No, 12,500.
That's
No,
right.
1,000. Yeah. But can you understand my logic of it when you're looking at it? And that's what I'm saying. Human beings aren't very good at understanding statistics and things like that. Because there's another one, isn't there, where it's like, I can't remember the exact thing, but there are 3 doors, and behind one of the doors is a Lamborghini. Behind one of them, there's a pile of shit, and behind the other one, there's nothing. If I say to you, do you want door 1, door 2, or door 3? And you say, okay, I've got one in my mind. I'm going to pick door number 2. And then I show you one of the other 2 that isn't the Lamborghini. Yeah? Now I say to you, do you want to change your mind or stick with your original one? The right answer is change your mind. Because statistically, you've got far more chance of getting it right. And our brains can't compute this. It's like, what? Well, I've got a 50-50 chance now. You haven't. Because of whatever you've just done here, this calculating and all this nonsense, it works the same way. And I've seen people trying to explain it and nobody believes it. They're like, no, it doesn't work. And I can't remember what it is now. It might have been 4 doors and you show one or whatever it was.
I think you got to change the example slightly.
But it was something like that. I think it was 3. I think it was 3 doors.
So there's 3 doors.
3 doors.
One of them
Behind
has...
them's a Lamborghini. One's a pile of shit and one's nothing. You say to me, I want door number 3. And I go, okay. I'm going to now show you what's behind door number 1.
And it's not
there's nothing in there.
And it's not the Lamborghini.
It's not the Lamborghini.
Well, that means the Lamborghini is left behind one of the other
One
doors.
of those 2. Now I say to you, do you want to keep your original choice or do you want to change? Here we go.
Well, it doesn't matter.
Here we go. Here it is. Yes, it does matter. This is what I'm saying to you. Suppose you're on a game show and you're given the choice of 3 doors. Roll it up a bit. Behind one door is a car. Behind the others, goats. You pick a door, say number 1. And the host, who knows what's behind the doors, opens another door, say number 3, which has a goat in it. He then says to you, do you want to pick door number 2? Is it your advantage to switch your choice? Should you switch? Believe it or not, it's actually to your benefit to switch. If you switch, you have roughly a 2 in 3 chance of winning the car. If you stick to your original choice, you have roughly a 1 in 3 chance of winning the car.
Go back to the explanation.
Just there. A more intuitive way to look at it. Yeah. A lot of people have trouble with the better odds of switching doors, myself included, until I realised simple fact. The odds are better if you switch because Monty curates the remaining choices. Let's say you played the game where Monty doesn't know the location of the car. It wouldn't make any difference if you switch or not. Your odds would still be 50-50
Well,
no matter
there you
what.
go. There's the key
But
information.
this isn't what happens. The Monty Hall problem has a very specific clause. Monty knows where the car is. He never chooses the door with the car. And by curating the remaining doors, he raises the odds that switching is always a good bet.
So in the example you gave, it would make no difference because it doesn't have a clause in it.
But I said to you, he chooses the one that it's not in it. So that means he knows the one that it is in it.
No, we didn't know he knows where it is.
But what I'm saying to you is the logic behind the lock is you've only got to get 4 of these numbers right, and there's only 10 there. So it can't be a 1.2 chance in 12,500. Well, when you've just done that and you're saying, well, yeah, it is. And that's what I'm saying. People, it's very difficult sometimes
It's
for people
bizarre.
to understand.
How high do you
sizes.
reckon? How high can you count to on your fingers?
Infinite.
But you've only got 10 fingers.
Well, you just stop. Well, 10 then.
You know, you mentioned binary earlier.
Yes.
The way to if you want to count really, really high on your fingers, use binary. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12.
Yeah.
Each finger is a binary.
Yes.
So 1, 2, 4, 8, 16. And Ben, Google how high you can count on one hand or both hands. It's obscene.
Here's one for you then.
Obscene.
How many basketballs can you fit through a basketball ring at the same time?
At the same time.
Mm-hmm.
1.
Side by side. 2.
Oh, yeah.
You can. The size of a basketball ring
31.
is twice
hang
the
on.
size of a ball. So you can fit 2 basketballs through a proper basketball ring.
Finger binary is that okay? So that's on. So on one hand you can count to 31. Well, that makes sense because
Using
there's one.
fingers of one hand, or 1,023 using both hands. Wow.
Cool, isn't it?
Yeah. I'll never ever use that knowledge in my life because I've got an iPhone.
You will because you'll
I won't. I'll
you'll,
tell
you'll
somebody
present it to someone on your podcast.
I'll present. Look, there you go. 2 basketballs. That's mad, isn't it?
Yeah.
So when you take a shot in basketball and you miss, it's not because the ring's small, it's because you're shit. 2 basketballs. Do you want to know another fact about sphere? You know
About
if
what, sorry?
A sphere. You know if you were to take the Earth and shrink it down to the size of a billiard ball, it would be smoother. Or if you were to blow a billiard ball or snooker ball up to the size of the Earth, it would be more jagged than the actual Earth.
Yeah,
That's
it
unbelievable.
would be
isn't
smoother than any snooker ball
Smoother
ever
than anything we've ever made.
made.
Yes. Because from the top of Mount Everest to the bottom of the Mariana Trench is something like 28 miles.
Do you know what the radius of the Earth is?
The radius is the full width across? Halfway.
Width.
Well, it's
6,000.
24,000 miles round, so 6,000.
6,000 kilometers.
Yes. Yeah. Which is a lot. Which is, we're talking about the sniper guy that just came in. He has to calculate for the curvature of the Earth when they're taking a shot over long distance.
Even over, what did you say? It was 800 and something.
876 or something meters.
That's a long way away.
It's nearly a kilometre away. It's a long way. But I don't think it's just purely the curvature of the Earth. I think it's the gravitational pull.
How did he know he got the headshot?
It was confirmed kill by somebody that was there. Said, yeah, you've took his head out. And I think they're obviously going, I don't know if they've checked the body or whatever. But he said the guy was laying down in a bush and all he could see was the hand and the crosshairs of the AK-47 or what it was. So he's like, I'm lining it up. I'm measuring wind, speed, this, that, and the other. He's like, right, there's the gun. So probably heads there, going, poof. And he says, instantly, because I've asked him what the delay was between pulling the trigger and the shot. He said, it's instant. He said, it's just gone down. He's like, I've hit him here. Because he was prone. And then one of the guys said, they confirmed, they said, yeah, he took the back of his head out.
Imagine how well you could train an artificial an AI system to do that.
Well, have you seen the robots? Ben, get the robots throwing basketballs from the halfway line. I think they've missed one ever. It's unbelievable. But yeah, you know, when you take out any human error and it's indoors, so there's no wind. I mean, it's just ba-dum. It's unbelievable to watch it. Exclusively for mature singles. Check this out. It is unbelievable.
Record-breaking basketball robot. Even in the pressure of the game, most basketball players can land a free shot in the hoop. But imagine hitting the target not once, but more than 2,000 times.
2,000 times in a row.
It's the world record-breaking achievement of CUE3.
Why isn't it
A
infinite,
basketball-playing robot created
got it
by
right.
a team of terrific
Don't know.
engineers.
Maybe over 2,000 shots, something slightly worn in the palm of the hand or in the elbow joint or something that has,
Or the ball dynamics. Of
yeah,
force.
something. 2,000 in a row. This is madness. But it just shows you, and for anybody that's out there and you're a budding athlete, repetition is the key.
Yes.
Repetition is the key. Look
You know,
at that.
It's not as impressive as it looks so basic, though, doesn't it? It's only doing such a basic movement.
It is, but but look where he's shooting it from.
Yeah.
Oh, it's a good distance, that is. Look at that. I mean, it's the arc, the spin.
Wow.
It's unbelievable.
Yeah.
2,000 in a row, not 10.
It's the consistency that we
Yes.
find so amazing, though,
It
isn't
is.
it? It's not physically what it's doing.
No, but also, if you've ever shot a basketball, you know, it is the tiniest movement of a finger
Yes.
or of an elbow. I mean, this is just spot on. I've often said, could you imagine programming 2 robots one to be Federer and one to be Djokovic, and make them play with no emotion. So they're not missing shots because they've got a little bit edgy or a bit nervy. They're just robotic at that skill level. I mean, people think they've seen some tennis before, but that would be next level, wouldn't it? But again, it would become boring, wouldn't it?
People haven't seen tennis unless they've watched it from 2005 to 2012.
Yeah.
But do you remember we grew up? I remember you saying to me, I think it was about 2011, 2012, 2010, something like that. You were like, I don't see how men's tennis could get any better.
Mm-hmm.
We were so spoiled.
We were, but it does look like it's evolving. Again.
Go and watch those previous matches, though.
But we'll look back at those matches in another 15 years' time and think how dated they look.
I don't think we will. Djokovic has won 3 slams in 2023. And he's 75, 80% of what he was. Go back and watch him 10 years ago. He's not the same player. Nowhere near.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, food for thought.
Are you going? Let's do it. Jamie, good man. A different conversation. A deep-thoughted conversation. Get back to your missus. Is that where you're going to?